Hi, and welcome to today's talk, which is called The Imaginary is a Real Thing, and it's about witches and psychedelics and strange things in medieval Christian culture, which is all interesting things, and I hope that you'll enjoy it. The imaginary is a real thing. Well, the history of psychoactive substances and occult practice is fascinating, to say the least. And although one could probably never find an absolute equation or relationship between the two, their tandem history of altered states gives enough evidence of kinship. And as with all things that touch or stem from what Joseph Campbell called the inner reaches of outer space, both the use of psychoactive agents and irrational ritual behavior originate in shamanism, as does the larger human construct of religion. All things inner, magical, spiritual, etc., can be traced back to the integration in the human mind of an intuitive, natural, that is, not intellectually constructed by a human mind via language, a pantheistic appreciation that everyone and everything is connected and ensouled, and that there is a lot more to learn from than what meets the eye or any of the other senses. Shamanism is the very bedrock of human knowledge in general, and of inner knowledge in particular. As all later inner practices then stem from shamanism, it is this foundational phenomenon that we must lean on when we're looking at any kind of spiritual or magical phenomenon, such as, for instance, medieval witchcraft. Now, witchcraft is a cluster term. And it's a cluster term for a multitude of practices, many of which are still performed, upheld, developed, and in some traditions possibly with unbroken lines of teaching. But in many ways, witchcraft could be seen as the currently most formalized keeper of a shamanic tradition in the European sphere. Many other cultures, specifically indigenous ones, still have active shamanic legacies, but not so in the homogenized Christian cultures. The usual main shamanic focus is healing, helping, acquiring knowledge and wisdom, and techniques like inner traveling, communicating with non-tangible entities and intelligences, nature worship, integrating pantheism, etc. These all stem from inner practice in its purest form, that is, in direct individual experience or in small esoteric groups. The integration the integration of psychoactive components in shamanic practice, as well as in witchcraft, facilitates the necessary flight into other inner realms. There are other and perhaps more central techniques, for instance drumming and or using other rhythms of different frequencies, as well as induced physical exhaustion. But the history of human spirituality and proto-religion has indeed been one steeped in intoxication. When shamans go to different spheres to find their answers, it's a rationally irrational and active use of the human imagination faculty integrated in a supportive cultural context, integrating elements in and from nature, from macrocosmic speculations to microcosmic experimentation, like proto-medicine. Witchcraft has been an active keeper of human and shamanic wisdom, as well as of a rich psychopharmacopoeia, since linear time was invented. Medieval witchcraft is a strange research subject, because so much of the documentation stems from antagonistic or decidedly malevolent sources. The witch craze contained deeply and morbidly absurd instructional tomes for amateur inquisitors and public officials alike. Unfortunately, resulting in very tangible torture and genocide. Occult practices and the use of psychedelics have of course never been condoned within Christian tyranny, but I suspect the medieval witches were victims of unfortunate general circumstance rather than of specific esoteric and psychoactive practice. There are similarities throughout the many centuries of persecution as well as in different regions. Many of the so-called trials were at civil courts, and accusations popped up from so-called ordinary people more than from centralized clerical quarters. Witches were scapegoats picked out for their outsider status and for keeping and fanning a flame that wasn't condoned by accepted norms and behaviors. When people needed a love potion, a sexual partner, a child, an abortion, or some kind of secret counseling, everything was fine and dandy. But when famines, plagues, and infant deaths, so common to the era, hit the poor population all over Europe, witches became very convenient targets for compensatory accusations, which served the church very well, as the witches were obviously dealing in some kind of original natural wisdom that had been appropriated and sanitized by their own earlier church fathers. No competition allowed. As the judges in question were officially negative to anything or anyone opposed to the prejudiced doctrines of the Christian churches, we have to assume that the diametrical opposite of whatever these judges claimed actually constitutes the truth. Between the years 1400 and 1750, approximately 100,000 human beings, mostly women, were prosecuted for witchcraft in Europe and America. The accusations often had very little to do with concrete crimes, as in there being perpetrators and victims, but they were mainly projected fantasies from disgruntled neighbors and perverted minds within anxious power structures that simply disliked independent women as much as they did liberating inner or shamanic experiences. The combination of these two then became a license not only to kill but also to happily torture innocents, while making enforced statements, new truths for posterity, some of which are actually still lingering on ad verbatim in the most retrograde monotheistic communities. This certainly explains why certain societies, as in groups, orders, or communities, have chosen to be secretive and immersed in complex esoteric symbolisms. The medieval witch craze has, unfortunately, only been one of many occurrences of this kind of draconian behavior within monotheism. It is, however, one of the most interesting occurrences to look at when we want to learn more about the dynamics of draconian transference. Witchcraft and/or the magical uses of psychedelics weren't set back by the mock trials and dire sentences as much as the normal historian or interpreter would believe, but rather the contrary. The romanticized or even fetishized trauma of the genocidal atrocities and all of the fanciful accusations in account as well as in iconography actually helped create the very worst nightmare the Christian church could ever envision. That their own cluster of lies would much later become an actual truth that would revisit them to bite their own behinds. What I mean by this is that the formulation of alleged horrendous behaviors, demons, devils, monsters, etc., via Christian minds and mouths, and in printed so-called witch hammers ablaze with demonological illustrations and detailed descriptions of a multitude of perverted behavior, actually did become parts of a romanticized witchcraft, which integrated a historic knowledge of herbs, plants, and spirits alike, as well as of customs and trials many hundreds of years later. Today, the once so monstrous emblems of fear are integrated as semi-humorous status symbols in neo-pagan groups flaunting expensive reissued editions of medieval grimoires. Experimental ritual behavior within these groups stems not necessarily from evanescent fantasies of some innocent antiquity via inspired minds like Margaret Murray, Gerald Gardner, and Alex Sanders, but from the dark sadomasochistic dungeons underneath pious Christian monasteries. In many ways, the aggressively repressed Christians didn't manage to suppress anything at all, but on the contrary helped unleash exactly the monsters they were so afraid of. The witch craze of the medieval centuries brought to light not only man's inhumanity to man and woman, but also some evidence of a chemo-gnostic relationship to folk magical practice, which is very much a legacy of shamanism. Given that there was no written communication on this folk level during this period, intellectual concepts journeyed in other forms, in myths, stories, songs, etc. As these migrated and were transmitted trans-regionally and trans-generationally, more and more of a local cultural flavor was added. Over the centuries, classic Eleusinian death and rebirth myths morphed into local stories, integrating local languages, symbols, divinities, and plants. The key to the mysteries lay in nature herself. Nature offered ways and techniques of letting the human being see herself in a new light. And this was also more or less wholly agnostic concept, that is, one where the numinous touched and taught the individual directly, without any need of human structures or proxies. So, what kind of knowledge has been passed on throughout the millennia? There is the proto-shamanic traveling technique, of course, but also information on supplemental psychoactive ingredients like plants, mushrooms, and herbs. Journeying in the inner to a netherworld, an upper world, and other variants in between, being guided by power animals, spirits, plants, and other non-tangible sentiences. Acquiring knowledge for all possible kinds of uses, etc. The underlying idea is holistic and conveying that A, it's easy to get there, and B, it's as real as anything else you perceive with your senses. Traditionally, the journeys have been aided by plants and other organic agents from nature, most often within a structure of drumming or rhythmic pulses. And scientific analysis has helped us isolate these key agents within the agents, so to speak. And basically, none of these have recently been discovered by humans. Knowledge of psychotropic herbs, mushrooms, and plants has been with us for a long, long time. It is a knowledge as distinctly human as the use of fire and the use of language. Using these activating agents within shamanic contexts has the power to set you free, that is, allow you to leave rational mind traps, the sensory hegemony, inherited morals, and basic concepts like time and space. The experience can be pleasurable or not, and it will leave you with truly additional information about yourself and the world you inhabit. And this very pantheistic approach, in which everything and everyone is ensouled and connected, is the foundation for what later on became religion. And the more the human being hubristically distanced herself from nature as such, the less she appreciated or encouraged pantheism in favor of simpler concepts like dogmatic monotheism. The common perspective within academia, or established perspectives, in regard to the history of esoteric drug use has been one of resignation, all too easily forgetting that myths and the imaginary usually tell us a lot more than analyses of pipes, bowls, broomsticks, and other possible utensils. Brian Inglis, the open-minded Irish writer and TV personality, summed up the dilemma like this in the 1970s. I quote Inglis: "We will probably never know for certain what the constituents were of Homer's Nepenthe. or what drug was used in the shamanist Eleusinian cult in ancient Greece, in which the initiate was given a potion designed to induce delectable visions, after which he could never be the same again. In general, the information about drugs and their social effects in classical times and in the Middle Ages is too scanty and unreliable to serve as a basis for anything more than enjoyable speculation. However, the very same author, Brian Inglis, couldn't help but in the same text provide a petty proviso, thus indulging in this kind of enjoyable speculation himself. I quote Inglis again. Drugs crop up chiefly in connection with witchcraft. Professor Michael Harner has recently argued that they were of central importance to witchcraft in Europe, but that this has been obscured by the fact that so much of the source material, most of it in Latin, has never been studied by anybody with an interest in this aspect of the subject. From the later evidence of witchcraft trials, it is clear that witches employed such plants as henbane and deadly nightshade, sometimes making them into unguents and smearing them on parts of their bodies as a way of liberating themselves to undertake their Sabbath rides. It is also clear that, like shamans, they believed that while they were under the influence of these drugs, they really could fly through the air. End quote. It should probably be mentioned here that shamanism scholar Michael Harner's perspective was that medieval witchcraft was a debased form of shamanism, which the hostility of the church had prevented from coming out into the open. But recently, things have changed, not only in the presentation of material previously only available in rare manuscript form and containing drug references. For instance, Touch Me Not, a most rare compendium of the whole magical art published by Folklore, but also in the reformation of a consciously expressed contemporary witchcraft aware of possible mythic interpretations of legacies and lines, but at the same time definitely reconstructing as much as creating anew. The strong interest in theological magical systems stemming from antiquity and classical grimoires signals a desire to reconnect with the mythic and make it both tangible reality and useful technology in contemporary and causally chaotic times. Scarlet Imprint founder Peter Gray, a distinct advocate of working with old materials in present time, writes in his book Apocalyptic Witchcraft on the subject of unbroken traditions. I quote Peter Gray. However you wish to cut it, this is not the case in the West. There is no evidence for the survival of a complex system. We are the inheritors of splintered bones, toppled crosses, and violated grave mounds. Our task is only beginning, though it would be more lucrative and reassuring to claim otherwise. Scraps of folklore need to be underpinned by a complete set of bones, or they are simply rags blowing in the wind. Yet perhaps the Sabbath itself is the key to re-establishing our cults. We must be honest about this and acknowledge the debt we owe to the living traditions that are helping us reanimate our own. End quote. That Gray's own generation has integrated psychedelics in these traditional reformations is well known and could be the subject of a wholly separate study, or many actually. I quote Gray again. The empire has several other witch hunts which run concurrently. First is the war against drugs. As witches, our use of entheogens, plant medicine, and even organic and homegrown food places us on that watch list. End quote. Eminent psychedelics researcher and scholar Patrik Lundborg touches upon possible agents within European witchcraft in his amazing book, Psychedelia, An Ancient Culture, A Modern Way of Life. Where psilocybin mushrooms were quite likely ingredients in European witchcraft, as was ergot on different corns in southern and central Europe, the most likely ones are actually from a different family and a less pleasant one. And these are called the Solanacean or potato family, including Atropa belladonna, which is deadly nightshade and belladonna, Hyoscyamus, henbane or stinking nightshade, Mandragora, which is mandrake all round, and Datura stramonium, thornapple, agent's trumpet, Jimson weed. These are all absorbed in the blood flow via the skin and are most efficiently absorbed in ointment form via mucous membranes. If we speculatively enter vaginal and anal membrane territories and take into account insertions of phallic items like witches' brooms smeared with ointment, it is then not far-fetched to state that the psychedelic or deliriant agents have been literally intimately connected also with sexual experiences, masturbatory or together with others within a possible group. The psilocybin and lysergic histories should not be underestimated. Psychedelic mushrooms have been central to human culture and inner work for millennia. The ingestion of ergot on rye and other corns was used by midwives to induce abortions and also, in milder doses, to stop bleeding and ease birth pains. And this was the original incentive for Dr. Albert Hofmann to study this particular agent, which, as we know, led on to the synthesis of LSD-25 and its massive cultural influence. Midwifery has traditionally been associated with wise women and witches, and it should be safe to say that the vice versa is also true. European witches were associated with life and death mysteries in general folklore, which provided them not only with beneficial respect, but also with detrimental prejudice and accusations of trafficking with forces larger than human life, etc. Excuse me. The Solanacean family is usually called deliriant rather than psychedelic because of its violent and uncontrollable nature. Ergot on various corns can easily be overdosed too, including the phenomena of St. Anthony's fire, which is essentially food poisoning, often leading to death, as well as more convulsive spasms, often with ensuing psychedelic states. Perhaps we can assume, given that we have no evidence about these ancient witches' knowledge of dosing to achieve controllable trips, that the wild ride of the witches, broom-induced or not, was in great part due to uncontrollable physical fits parallel to out-of-body psychedelic experiences. This sounds pretty proto-shamanic to my ears. What or who these brave women found during their wild flights very likely had to do with securing concrete answers to current questions. It seems on the whole to not have been joyrides at all, and perhaps any sexual or pleasurable elements in the initial ingestion stages of these trips were actually deemed necessary to embark in the first place. In various forms, the basic agrarian myths have lived on all over Europe, often with only minimal variations. The mysteries of farming were integrated in a general pan or polytheistic pagan mindframe, and no Christian attempts could ever eradicate this. Well, not before industrialization and urbanization anyway, and that's not specifically a Christian phenomenon. The Greek drama starring agriculture goddess Demeter, her daughter Persephone, and Pluto, god of the dead, has been one of the most important myths of the Western cultural sphere. To make a massive myth a short story, Persephone is kidnapped by Pluto and taken to the netherworld. Demeter is heartbroken and furious and curses plants and crops in rage. The gods react to this as humans without crops can't make sacrifices to them. So a deal is struck. Pluto gets Persephone for a third of the year, while her mother gets her 2/3, so that they can bless the earth and grow things again together. While Demeter was in grief, she was taken in by the royal family of Eleusis, and not being allowed alcohol while grieving, she was presented with something else. This was symbolically, or not, retained in the later Eleusinian mysteries and plays, which presented each candidate with this very same something else, which then led to a death and rebirth ritual in enactment and in the inner spheres of the celebrant. If Demeter's main trip, pardon the pun, were corn mysteries, what in this drama could have triggered the feeling of being reborn and also getting a younger version of yourself back from the reign of death, to facilitate for new natural progress? Gordon Wasson, the mycologist so seminal to the psychedelic movement of the mid to late 20th century, asked his friend Albert Hofmann, the creator of LSD, whether the Eleusinian rites could have something to do with ergot, the parasite affecting different forms of corn and some forms of grass. Hofmann, being the world's foremost expert on the subject, answered yes. I quote Hofmann: "Early man in ancient Greece could have arrived at an hallucinogen from ergot growing on wheat or barley. An easier way would have been to use the ergot growing on the common wild grass paspalum. This is based on the assumption that the herbalists of ancient Greece were as intelligent and resourceful as the herbalists of pre-conquest Mexico." End quote. The connection between psychedelic initiation, associated inner work, and revelations within a rural framework of learning about the seasons and farming thus established. We can look at corn farming folklore basically anywhere in Europe. It basically tells the same story over and over again, where the original mysteries allowed the natural context, farming, to become a symbol of an individual journey and development. In many regions it was also acted out communally in times of sowing and harvesting. The last sheath of harvest, usually called the corn mother, has traditionally been saved until the next sowing season, and even dressed up as a woman and danced with. Corn mother in German is Kornmutter, and a slight twist gives Mutterkorn, which has been a common name for corn affected by ergot, and one of the first things that Hofmann studied. I quote Hofmann: "In German folklore there was a belief that when the corn waved in the wind, the corn mother, a demon, was passing through the field. Her children were the rye wolves, ergot. In our context we observe that of these names, two, Seigle Ivre, drunken rye, and Tollkorn, mad grain, point to a knowledge of the psychotropic effects of ergot. And this folk awareness of the mind-changing effects of ergot shows an intimate knowledge of its properties, at least among herbalists, deeply rooted in European tradition." End quote. Now, who were essentially the herbalists in rural medieval European cultures? That's right, the witches. As these wise women knew how to handle herbs, plants, and mushrooms, perhaps it's obvious that they were also blamed when things stemming from nature and the very same agents took on dangerous forms. There were, for instance, several occurrences of mass afflictions of St. Anthony's fire during the medieval centuries because people had eaten bread contaminated by ergot. And this wasn't empirically established until the 17th century. Hence, a more intuitive blame game against the witches seems likely earlier on than this. And already in 1582, a physician in Frankfurt, Germany, called Adam Lonitzer, wrote that ergot had been used by midwives for centuries, mainly to precipitate childbirth. And already then, the problems with correct dosage, both in terms of uterine spasms and postpartum hemorrhage, were well known. And this knowledge of controlling the uterine queendom must surely have been of interest to the Christian Church. Specifically if these wise women could and would abort unwanted fetuses in other women in early stages of pregnancy. The human need to share extraordinary experiences is sometimes a dangerous quality. If someone, whether woman or man, returns from a psychedelic and revelatory inner journey and relays what they experienced to someone not initiated, the consequences could be, and in this case probably were, disastrous. Where no psychological or otherwise abstracted explanation models existed, malevolent minds that heard or overheard stories of strange inner journeys during which amazing creatures and intelligences communicated with the traveler could so easily retell these stories in an accusatory way to people in power who could provide them favors or status enhancers. Thus, an avalanche of persecutions and psychosis in which psychonauts and tradition bearers became victims of joined simpletons and anxious monotheists. And as mentioned earlier, between the years 1400 and 1750, approximately 100,000 human, mostly women, were prosecuted for witchcraft in Europe and America. It remains one of the most bestial and shameful cultural genocides in human history, and it's very likely that this often happened and spiraled because of mere hearsay and ill will. The anti-witchcraft sentiments of medieval times were not necessarily a patriarchal given or standard at all, but to a great degree constituted a specific misogynistic variant of monastic homosexuality instigated by common folks, which were the obvious threats to this power structure. The individual, the freethinker, the heretic, the dissident, woman, female sexuality, non-procreative sexuality outside of the walls of the monastery, invisible transcendence, unfettered emotional spheres, proximity to the active contact with nature, keeping secrets, knowledge of life and death, as in midwifery, healing, medicinal wisdom, magic, etc., without supernatural monotheistic explanations or theories. Now, what to do about anyone or anything that contained even an inkling of these essentially quite general human qualities? Draconian counterforce, of course. Torture, enforced and constructed confessions, imaginary beings and conspiracies, the Sabbath's osculum infame, the kiss of shame, as a projection of male homosexual desire, with the devil as a big top that needs to be serviced in order to facilitate for the humble ass-kisser's self-eradication through penetration, which then brings shame and self-flagellation, torture, etc. Christ on the cross, Saint Sebastian, and all these icons are icons within this environment and culture because of the vivid description of the sexually repressed male. The strong male body is violently affixed to erect wood, rendered impotent but compensationally susceptible to penetration by nails, bolts, spearheads, arrows. And please note that in the Christian mythos, this is not a rape scenario, but a voluntary submission to a brute, overpowering phallic force. And please also take in consideration another important aspect of this strange myth. A child conceived by a mother not penetrated and impregnated by the father or even a human male, but by a supernatural force. The primal function of the human father figure is removed, and the mother is sanctified by supernatural proxy powers. Projecting this perverted construct onto a male baby will surely create interesting fantasies in the child and young adult, who will certainly be integrating compensational elements of what later became known as the Christ complex. A violently repressed sexuality, fueled by the above story as its central myth, provoked religious hallucinations both within monasteries and convents, and this psychosis spread and was encouraged by outer worldly power structures too, perhaps to keep the disgruntled proletariat happy with a new and more absurdist kind of Circus Maximus. Aldous Huxley's classic novel The Devils of Loudun and Ken Russell's wonderful film adaptation, The Devils, shows the frenzy with which this was acted out in a convent, and where communal sexual repression resulted in complete dissociation and hallucinatory states of mind, a form of religiously sanctioned, institutionalized insanity. Unfortunately, also with the result that many innocent women, and men too for that matter, were brutally murdered. The roots of the medieval so-called witch craze thus only in part lie in the ostracizing of women outside of homogeneous cultures per se, because of poverty, weirdness, non-adaption, knowledge of magic, unwillingness to provide sexual favors, etc., as has been suggested by many anti-patriarchal interpretation models. And only in part can we blame the actual occultism and drug use, as these aspects were in the preferred hidden until they were drawn out by force and justifying coercion. The overall roots of this tragedy can be found in the power of the Christian Church, mainly the Catholic cult, to affect mundane and political affairs. When and where the Christian cult thrived, business, tolerance, progress, and culture usually did not. The Italian city-states during the Renaissance are usually pointed out as a high tide marker in the creation of Western civilization, and these were places and eras where art, philosophy, esotericism, magic, and science were allowed a considerably longer leash than usual. Considerably more so if you were well educated and male than if you were a poor rural woman, of course, but still, the stifling intolerance of Christianity was less present. The problems essentially began when the monastic culture integrated learning of more kinds than strictly religious ones. The big European monasteries became libraries and intellectual centers, as well as archives of many dissident teachings. Monks became students not only of God's will, but also of human history and learning in general. And this also included medicinal and healing knowledge, as well as farming ditto. As these intellectually vital environments degenerated into power-broking centers under the intolerant thumb of the Vatican, any outsiders who possessed a similar or even original kind of knowledge, whether shamanic, witch, or natural experimentalist, were simply deemed heretical. Although grandiose political opponents and the odd brilliant proto-scientist were most often male and easy targets because of easily provoked male oppositional pride, the women were of a different nature, literally. This made them even more threatening to a homogeneous male power structure who regarded women in general as nothing more than Christian baby ovens. What horrible things were going on in secret? What were these women up to? Of course, there were pagan traces in rural Europe through which women and men worked with nature in shamanic practices, but the central issue wasn't so much these actualities as the monastic fantasies that fed the power. If the supposedly crazy women didn't confess to any wrongdoing, all one had to do was torture them until they did. Fiction became fact as wise women were tortured to death. In essence, what we're seeing when looking at the relationship between medieval witchcraft and psychedelics is a scenario where actual facts are mixed with actual fiction. Ample documentation from what would appear to be the victors paints a picture of their insanity more than that of any witches, organized or not. In the aftermath, we see enthusiastic neo-pagans on the one hand, willing to create something new out of a mythic witchcraft, including psychedelics, and whether based on actual lineages or not. On the other hand, we see more or less impotent academics regurgitating the same footnotes and troubled relationship to Margaret Murray over and over and over. And these crazy medieval centuries tell a fascinating story about when and how a life-affirming pantheistic shamanic fertility cult was attacked by a brutal monotheistic death cult. That the first have used psychoactive agents in their important work, both in normal day-to-day situations and under cultic ritual umbrellas, is beyond any doubt, and that the latter have aggressively denied themselves and their followers these same agents is also beyond any doubt. And on this end note, I find it an interesting insight that the same family of plants can contain such different forms and attitudes, yet carry such perfect symbolic weight in this context. The Solanacean plants used by witches on their wild, ecstatic and revelatory individual journeys to the Sabbath are related to the potato that was fermented in the strong alcoholic liquids used to enslave and numb and dumb down the populace. Thank you. Thank you for tuning in and listening. And yeah, I'll see you soon again. Thank you very much.